So who here, but by show of hands, who has heard of that legendary American blood feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys? Have you heard of this? All right. So even if you haven't heard of it, can you guess what kicked it all off? Throw out a guess about what kicked it all off. Or leave me hanging, that's okay. Land? Good guess. But you're thinking up here, think stupider. Really dumb, think really dumb. What do you got? A woman. I don't know if you want to follow up my statement, think dumber with that, Paul, but I'll leave you to reckon with Julie over that one. But not a woman, not a woman. Not money, think dumber. You guys are thinking up here, you're just too smart. Landscaping, no. One more guess. A slight? No, it was a pig. Literally a pig, that's it. The feud that would scar two families for decades, because it all started because one side thought that the other had stolen a pig. So picture the place. It took place in the Tug Fork Valley in the late 1800s. That's where West Virginia and Kentucky press up against each other. It's a place full of steep wooded hillsides, hollers carved out by creeks, cabins with smoke curling out of chimneys, and families scraping by on what they could harvest from the land. This was a place where they didn't have a whole heck of a lot, so honor and reputation meant everything. In 1878, one Randolph McCoy accused one Floyd Hatfield of stealing one of his pigs. Not jewelry, not money, not riches of any sort, but a pig that had funny little notches in its ears. The case went to trial. A neighbor swore in court that he could recognize the animal as Hatfield property by the notches in its ears. The judge thus sided with the Hatfields, and the pig went home. The McCoys' pride, however, did not. And in a world where honor outweighs common sense, bruised pride never sits still. First came a fist fight, and then a shooting, and then a revenge killing. The hills began to ring with gunfire, with ambushes, with raids. Smoke from burned cabins rose above the treetops. Mothers buried sons, widows wept, and by the time it was over, dozens were dead. And not just young hotheads, but cousins and children's and in-laws. The whole web of kin had been dragged into the mess. The feud grew so violent, in fact, that the governors of both Kentucky and West Virginia actually had tried to step in to stem the bloodshed. And eventually, an interstate raid of one family on the other led to a court case that found its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In the end, only one Hatfield was found guilty, a guy named Ellison Cotton Top Mounts. He was an intellectually disabled young man who took the fall for his whole family and was ultimately executed. So yes, a single pig, like a literal single hog, led to a violent generational blood feud that reached the Supreme Court and ended with, if not an innocent man, then perhaps at least the least guilty Hatfield of them all hanging from the gallows. And that is what cycles of revenge do. They start petty and they finish tragic. A stolen pig becomes an entire region in mourning. So the Hatfields and the McCoys, they had their pig, and Sampson had his riddle. So at this wedding feast to a Philistine woman, Sampson was apparently really feeling himself, and he decided to show off a little bit. He bet the guests at his wedding 30 outfits of fine clothing that they could not solve a riddle of his own devising. And here's that riddle one more time. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. And so that riddle was about the honey that he'd personally scooped from the carcass of a lion that he had previously killed. First off, That's nasty. Why is he doing that? That's just kind of gross. And then secondly, and more importantly, there is no way in the world that anyone other than Samson himself could possibly have known the answer to this. It's less a riddle to be solved and more a bizarre personal anecdote to be guessed at. Like I said, Samson, very strong physically, not all that bright. Predictably, the wedding guests couldn't solve the riddle, so they leaned on Samson's bride until she was able to wheedle the answer out of him. And when they came to him with the correct answer, Samson's ego cracked. And in a culture where honor outweighs common sense, bruised pride never sits still. Samson stormed off. He killed 30 Philistines in a nearby town and took their clothes in order to pay off his debt. He then stomped back to his hometown in a sulk. The Philistines retaliated by giving his wife to another man. So Samson retaliated by catching 300 foxes, tying torches to their tails, and sending them running through Philistine grain fields, vineyards, and olive groves as to set them on fire. So the Philistines, they retaliated even bigger. They burned Samson's wife and father-in-law alive. And of course, Samson retaliated again. He went full slasher film, and I quote, "He slaughtered them hip and thigh with a great slaughter." I don't really know what it means, but it sounds pretty awful. Eventually, fearing that they would end up as collateral damage, Samson's own people gladly turned him over to the Philistines. They bound him up with ropes and they handed him off. But in that very moment, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and in a truly cinematic moment, he snapped the ropes that bound him. He grabbed the jawbone of a donkey that happened to be lying nearby, and with that jawbone, he killed 1,000 people, or so says the story. But that cycle of revenge did not end there. Later on down the road, Samson fell in love with another Philistine woman, a woman named Delilah. And those of you of a certain age will realize that all week long I've had the Plain White Tee song, "Hey There, Delilah," going through my head. If you know it, it will be going through your head all the rest of the day as well. But he married this woman named Delilah, and acting at the behest of her countrymen, she cut Samson's hair while he slept, causing him to lose all that super strength of his. He was then seized by the Philistines, blinded, and forced to grind grain like an ox. Later on, they dragged him into their temple to perform tricks for their nobles like some sort of court jester. Finally, in one last surge of his super strength, Samson pushed against the pillars of that temple, quite literally bringing the house down. And while he managed to kill thousands of the Philistines that had been oppressing his people, Samson was killed right alongside of them. So we have this riddle, and it all ended with rubble. We have a wedding toast that ended with a body count in the thousands. And that is what cycles of revenge do. They can start like sitcoms, but then they end like horror films. The Hatfields and the McCoys, Samson, and the Philistines. We could dismiss them as backwoods squabbles and ancient myths, except that the cycle of revenge that we see in these stories, it hasn't went anywhere. And it went absolutely nowhere. We see it every day, and we live it every day. A friend shares your secret a little too freely, so you let slip something of theirs. A sibling makes a cutting remark at dinner, so you bring up that one story you know will sting. Here's one that's real. A driver cuts you off in traffic, so you tailgate them just a little bit closer than you need to. Or in the office, a coworker steals credit for your idea, so you make sure their mistakes start getting noticed, or you start forgetting to include them on work emails, and before long, the office feels less like a workplace and more like a Cold War with coffee mugs. And then, of course, online. One post, one offhand comment, and suddenly it's a pile-on, a 200-comment dumpster fire. Strangers hurl insults at strangers. Someone calls someone else a fascist. Someone calls someone a Nazi. and everyone leaves angrier than they started. Nothing gets changed except for the blood pressure of those involved. We all know this cycle too well. And on a much less catty level, we see the same cycle play out in the headlines every day, especially nowadays. October 7th, Hamas launched a brutal attack on Israeli civilians. Hundreds were slaughtered, families were taken hostage, communities were left in terror. In Israel, they struck back with overwhelming force, airstrikes that flattened entire neighborhoods. Hamas retaliated with more rockets. Israel answered with more bombs, and the spiral tightened, one attack provoking the next. Each side convinced that this round of violence, this time, would finally bring safety. And the toll of this cycle is staggering. Tens of thousands dead, and right now in Gaza, more than 500,000 people are facing catastrophic hunger, including tens of thousands of children. One act of violence begets another act of violence, begets another. Sampson has his foxtails and jawbones. Today we have drones and tanks. But when the smoke clears, the results are exactly the same. Thousands dead, grieving families, both peoples more wounded, neither people more free. And that is because the cycle of revenge never liberates, it only multiplies the wreckage. And that is certainly a way that you can choose to live your life. An eye for an eye, tit for tat. You can choose to live just like that. A lot of people do. But the thing is, if you're coming here, I presume it's because you care something about this Jesus guy. And you need to know that is decidedly not how Jesus lived. In fact, Jesus lived to show us another way entirely. It needs to be said that Jesus lived under Roman occupation, a world where violence was the real currency of the day, where the empire taught you to hit back harder or be crushed. Retaliation was the only script that people were taught. But even growing up in that context, Jesus offered a different script. To his followers, he said seemingly preposterous things that seemed preposterous back then, perhaps even more so today. He said things like, turn the other cheek. Things like, love your enemies. Things like, bless those who curse you. And he said those things not because he was naive, not because he thought that evil should be ignored, but because he knew that the cycle of revenge can never be won. It can only be broken. And the most poignant example of that, of course, I think, is the cross. Jesus was betrayed, he was mocked, he was beaten, and yet time and again he refused to return violence with violence. Instead, what he did was he stretched out his arms and he said, Father, forgive them. Right? He repaid violence with forgiveness. Many modern interpreters actually see this as the true power of the cross. It unmasks our whole system of scapegoating and revenge and disrupts it. It shows us where the cycle leads, and it shows us a way out. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King so eloquently summed it up, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. That's what real deliverance looks like. Not Samson's jawbone, not a nation's bombs, but the stubborn, defiant power of love. So what are we called to do? We are called to stop feeding that spiral. Stop feeding it in our family, stop feeding it in our office, stop feeding it in the world. Because the truth is, the cycle of revenge only keeps spinning if we keep spinning it. And Jesus has already shown us another way. So the good news this morning is this. The cycle of revenge can be broken. The better news this morning is this. We already know how. By responding to darkness with light, by responding to hate with love. And the best news is this. With the help of God's Spirit, we can live that way, not just for ourselves, but for the healing of the whole world. In Jesus' name, may it be so. Amen.